This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop. And the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies. And fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Really? I love that guy.
Yeah, me too. And tonight, we are going to talk about remakes. No, wait, reboots. Oh, no, sequels. Remakes, reboots, sequels. Oh my. Well, whatever we're talking about, it's all about doing it all over again. We're just going to talk about, people rehashing the same content over and over again and why they keep doing it again and again and again. Why do they do it, Don? Please tell me. I can't figure it out.
Well, this goes, ironically, to something we've brought up a few times on the show, is everything in entertainment comes down to the audience. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that gets neglected when people make comments about, say, the movie industry or TV or whatnot.
You mean it's not because they're out of ideas?
Oh, hell no. No, it's in a lot of ways, it's the exact opposite. Like, people will complain because they'll say, oh, they're making another, just to even keep it narrow, they're making like another Batman movie when there's like a million other characters they could pick. Mm-hmm. Well, it's true, but they know if they pick somebody else, there's a risk. People know that they like what they know. Mm-hmm. So everybody knows Batman. So a Batman movie, you're going to get a certain amount of asses and seats just because.
A lot of asses and a lot of seats.
But the thing with that, it creates that catch-22. Mm-hmm. Because they know if they go for the same old, that it's less of a risk.
Right. There's
a bigger chance the audience will go for it. Mm-hmm. But you risk that chance of creating fatigue.
Definitely. Like what happened with Spider-Man.
Yeah. Well, it did. Because what ends up happening, and this is the difficult part if you're selling any kind of entertainment. Mm-hmm. Entertainment's based on novelty. Mm-hmm. And we've mentioned that before. It's come up a few times.
Yes. But
the problem is if you go too novel, if you do something that's too new, too different, people stay away in droves because they don't know how to take it. They don't have like a template in their head. Like Batman's easy, big scary guy punches out bad guys. Okay, we understand that.
Yep.
You see it with, say, superhero fans will find like Japanese stuff baffling. Mm-hmm. And it's partly because you're dealing with another usual. You're dealing with another template, other standards. People don't know what it means when a Japanese character gets a nosebleed or makes certain funny noises, or they always have these weird nervous smiles. Well, it's that same idea. It's a different template. It's a different formula.
Right.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's somebody else's same old.
Right. Which can make you a little bit nervous if you're not used to it. You don't quite know how to take it or how to deal with it. And it's also not comforting at that point.
It isn't. And it also has the problem, too, that it takes a little more effort than a lot of audiences are willing to put into things.
True.
Because you have to pay a little bit more attention. You have to think about what you're seeing a little bit more. Mm-hmm. The old standard you get from people is, when I come home, I don't want to have to think. I want to just watch TV and relax. And that's why, they make 15 permutations of the Horrible Housewives of wherever, because it doesn't take a lot of effort to understand.
No, it does not.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also cheap too. There's that.
Yeah.
But then let's face it. I mean, let's look at a literary example. For example, romance novels. Every romance novel is the exact same story. All like 10 billion of them are all the exact same story.
Yeah.
Just over and over and over again. Yes, there are slight permutations. Yes, there are variations. Romance fans, I'm not slamming you for that. I know that there are lots of variations. There's the same as superhero books. Superhero books are all this exact same story. Permutations, yes. But they're still the exact same story over and over and over again. Why? Because people like it. It's safe, it's comforting, and there's something about that particular story that resonates with people.
There is, and it goes with that idea too. As soon as you can identify something as part of a genre, the audience knows what to expect.
They don't just know what to expect, they want it. That's one of the things that people have discovered, is that for the most part, people just want more of the same.
Yeah. And well, to a point, because the other confounding variable is an audience will get fatigued. If you give them the exact same, eventually they get tired of it because there's no longer a kick. You don't even get that minimal surprise. And that's why you'll see when a new genre takes off, it usually lasts for a little bit. And as it progresses, you'll see different permutations. So like romance novels. Say pirate romance novels get popular and it's all these Fabio-esque pirates in them, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Eventually they'll take it another step. It'll be they're not pirates. They're like 1950s gang guys because it's sort of similar. It's still familiar. Just enough of a twist. Eventually you try out all these permutations and you get to like dinosaurs.
Pretty much.
I don't know how dinosaur porn keeps working its way into the show, but...
Hey, romance novels are not porn. Exactly. Depends
wink,
on the book. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge,
yeah. But you get to that, and then what ends up happening is you've taken it as far as it can go, and either the audience loses total interest in it because they're fatigued. They've seen every possible permutation, or you've moved into something else, and now you've made something different, and the cycle starts all over again.
Yep, that's true. That's how new subgenres are born.
Yeah. And it's that idea like nothing comes out of nowhere. Nothing, because again, if you do something totally new, people won't know how to take it.
Yep.
But you always want something that it's just different enough that it feels like something new.
Right.
A good example of that would be, I think, Star Wars.
Okay, how so?
The original Star Wars comes out, and it really felt like something different. We'd had spaceship Evil Empire shows before, but space was usually very clean and antiseptic.
Right. Lucas
wanted it to look lived in, so you get all the Imperial stuff is, there's no dust anywhere, but all like the Rebel stuff is like duct taped together. All the settlements they go are these like grubby little worn out kind of things. It feels different. It feels new. That idea doesn't come out of nowhere because in the late 60s, going into the 70s, you had a lot of post-apocalypse stories.
Right, yeah.
And he had appropriated some of that imagery into Star Wars. So that creates something different by combining a couple of things that are already familiar.
Yes, definitely. And, of course, Star Wars itself is a giant pastiche, or collage. Collage is probably the better term. Collage of, like, many different sources, from samurai films to World War II, bombers to Gunga Din. It's a giant, collection. It's Tarantino-esque in a way. And so, he's taken elements of many different things that the audience was already familiar with, and then he brought them in. Actually, going to the bombers, that's a beautiful example. Remember that he actually used, World War II fighter film footage that the audience was kind of familiar with to produce the starfighter scenes. He was actually copying cockpit footage and everything from those scenes. The fighters move like World War II fighters because they are. And so he wasn't even trying to create a new paradigm there. He was working what the audience was already familiar with and just expanding on it and taking it in a slightly new direction. Yeah.
And then that ties in with some of the things that you get if you're dealing with a mass audience,
Mm-hmm.
you get weird little sub pockets. Because a lot of I hate the term, but a lot of hard sci-fi fans
Mm-hmm.
object to like space fighters like in Star Wars because they say it's not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
The irony is, like you said, they work like the kind of like World War II fighters that we'd seen in movies, we'd seen in real life for a lot of people at
Mm-hmm.
that time still.
Mm-hmm.
It was that familiarness. If he did them realistically,
Mm-hmm.
the audience would have thought it was horrible because they'd be like, that's not how it works. Even though it is, because the audience doesn't have familiarity with astrophysics.
Yep.
They're transposing what they already know into the story, and that's how they're making their judgments.
Yeah, pretty much. It's the same reason why, for the most part, starship combat in the original Star Trek is basically submarine combat.
Yeah.
They're using the submarine template as combat because that's kind of what they know. Submarine, more or less. Yeah, that's the best way to describe it, I'd say. And again, you're just working with what's already there because the audience can only stretch their minds so far. You generally have to work with what's already in their heads.
Yeah, and I've seen it mentioned for a lot of like nerdly productions that you can generally add one really weird aspect to the formula.
Similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That if you add more than that, you lose people.
Mm.
Because it becomes too hard to... It's not just too hard to juggle, but nobody comes into anything clean. They come into it, you have expectations, you have likes, you have dislikes.
Mm-hmm.
And any kind of like sellable media is playing off of those.
Yes, definitely.
And that's why you'll get a lot of it just is really, really... It plays into those expectations, even if the story or the setting or anything external like that is diminished because of expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Another example I can think of is if you do a movie where the female and male lead characters aren't making out at the end of the film,
Mm-hmm.
people get they're kerfluffled. It doesn't feel right just because every movie ever made, except one, that's what happens.
Right. That's true. Well, again, audience expectations. I mean, yeah, you get used to it. Also, remember that it's reinforcing a belief, right? The idea that if you were successful, you get the hot, attractive person. That's part of the reward, right? One of the rewards of life is that you get a hot, attractive mate.
Mm-hmm.
And we like to believe that that's going to happen to all of us. And for some of us it does, for some of us it doesn't. But the key point is we still like that idea. And we want to see that reinforced. If it doesn't get reinforced, it feels wrong for some people.
It does, and that's again where a lot of people complain about, especially say action movies, that they're dumbed down nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it's because of that idea that you're dealing with foreign markets,
Mm-hmm.
and the audiences will have a different expectation.
Yep. That's creating some real problems for Hollywood right now.
It can, because I can think of a few really notable ones, like anybody who's watched a lot of, say, Japanese stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's an attitude in the East that's more pervasive than here that likes to reward hard work.
Yes.
And that's why if you see like a Japanese series starts with the hero is always an idiot, he's a loser, he's lazy, he sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And the story is him knuckling under, pulling himself up by his bootstraps and becoming the hero.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Here we tend not to like that. We like our heroes to be awesome right from the beginning.
Yes. Well, it's a shortcut, right? We just kind of like to jump to the good part, so to speak.
Well, no, because for like say an action film, you never see the training montage except when the more awesome villain kicks the hero's ass in Act 1, and then at the beginning of Act 3, he's got to build up.
Right.
For the most part, like, the tough guy is just the tough guy right from the beginning. And they like to establish that, like, if you've ever seen, like a cop movie, they're all the same. You blew up downtown trying to stop this guy. You know, McGonagall, if you break the rules again, well, they already showed that this guy's established. He's a badass. Even his boss can't touch him. He's awesome.
Right. Well, that's very 80s, but yeah, okay.
Well, they still do it. Superhero movies kind of fudge that because they want to do the origin.
Mm.
But you find what you get in that case is very seldom do you really get the hero working hard to be the hero. Either something accidental catapults them into hero-ness,
Mm-hmm.
or even if they do the training montage,
Right.
there's something about this character that sets them apart right from the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So like when Bruce Wayne runs away for some reason to join Ra's al Ghul to become Batman, because we always have to tie everything closer together in every story.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Wayne as a kid is already a badass. He manages to sneak out. He, gets to the other side of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
he gives up all of his his wealth and material possessions to toughen up. He's already kind of he's not Batman yet, but you can already see there's something about this guy
Right.
that he's already more cool than you are, kind of thing.
So, as you said, they're already special in some way.
Yeah.
But that goes again with the idea of, I don't want to use the term, but I'll use it anyway. American exceptionalism. There's this, frontier spirit, the American icon of the cowboy, the rugged individual.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, Americans, and I shouldn't just, I'm not crapping just on Americans, because you'll see this in a lot of other cultures as well. The idea of the individual hero who's a self-made man and can handle himself and is, good in many different areas and is, just capable. That's the American ideal.
Mm-hmm.
That's the American ideal, the ideal that that they're shooting for. And that's what the audience wants to see, I guess.
It is. I think the term that I think works better, and you actually used it, was rugged individualism.
Mm.
And if you look at the States, there's other countries too, but the States is probably the most readily observable.
Mm.
That concept is entwined all throughout society.
Yeah, it is.
That it's the person that stands on their own,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't take help from everybody, doesn't whine, doesn't wheedle. They know it needs to be done, and they just suck it up and do it.
Yep, exactly.
And again, that concept, because it's so interlaid,
Mm-hmm.
it shapes that expectation.
Which is why, and I'm going to deviate from things here for a second. So I've been reading a book by a guy named John Truby,
Uh-huh.
and it's called The Anatomy of Story. 22 Steps to Becoming a Master Storyteller. This is part of I've been reading a whole bunch of different, books about storytelling and such, but
Right.
Truby points something out in the beginning of his book that I'd never really thought of before, and I actually have, the more I think about it, the more I've come to actually think he's right. He completely is that every story ultimately is you presenting, every story ultimately is the author presenting a worldview and the way they think things should be.
Okay.
Every story is ultimately a moral argument, but not necessarily good versus evil, although that's again a moral argument, but that every story has at its heart a kind of moral center, and that everything in the story expands out from that moral center. One example being, as we were just talking about, the idea of the rugged individual. That, the ultimate man and the most successful man or woman is a rugged individual who can handle themselves in any situation and, is just awesome. And that you can be born awesome. That's a moral argument. That's an argument based on the idea of, the American dream, I suppose, so to speak, or the American ideal. As opposed to, say, the Japanese one, which is that everyone is born average but has the potential to work hard and be a better member of society if they just work hard at it.
Mm.
And that every story, no matter what story it is ultimately presenting a worldview of some kind, and that's what truly shapes the story, according to Truby. Mm. And I've actually started to believe that I think that's correct. I think it really is. I think it's ingrained deeply into what we call stories. Right. I was actually talking to Graham, who we had on before about alternative role-playing games, my friend Graham McLean, and he mentioned that during his research, because he was doing his PhD on storytelling and narrativism and all that, and he said that there was some Russian researchers, whose names he's probably saying right now, but sorry, Graham, I can't remember offhand, who found that when they analyzed huge numbers of stories, they found that the one thing that was common to all of these stories, no matter what, was that they all ultimately had a moral center and a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else would be different, but they all still were rooted in some moral center or moral worldview. Again, I'm using the word morals, which people think of good and evil, but that's not what I mean. And what I'm talking about is you could almost say the right way to behave, or the right way these things should happen, or the right way to live, basically. Which goes back to the idea that we've discovered through science that human beings love stories. We are storytelling machines, basically. We both manufacture stories and we absorb them because we learn through story. We're wired to remember story. We're wired to learn from stories. So to us, any story we experience is actually a perspective of the world that we're taking in. And we're taking it in with the idea of we're learning from that person's perspective or from that story, whatever. There's something that we're getting from that story, almost like a simulation in a way, if you want to take it that way.
Right.
And what's even more interesting is our brains don't actually differentiate. Every story we take in as though it's a personal experience that we actually had to happen to ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's just our rational brain that says, no, I really didn't go off and fight the Galactic Empire and become a Jedi. Our rational brain says that. And of course, not all of our rational brains, but most people's rational brains say, that really didn't happen. But that's also where you get into that situation where people remember a story so well that they start to believe that it really did happen to them. Usually not fighting the Galactic Empire, but occasionally we tend to, change our history, our personal history, one way or the other. But anyway, going back to this then, so stories basically are all about people learning. They are all about people learning about how to behave, what it is to be human. And we're sharing that idea of humanness and being a human being in one form or another. Mm-hmm. And so again, going back to what Truby was saying, although he doesn't mention this specifically about the story learning part, that I would say that's where the whole moral thing is, right? Where Truby's saying, yes, all stories are about humans teaching other humans how to behave, basically. It's all about what it is to be human and how people should deal with different situations and different circumstances. And that can be whether it's even a romance novel. Doesn't matter. It's still teaching you how you should behave in a relationship. Or the nature of things, as we wish they were anyway.
Because I think he's right. And I think it ties into something else important. But I also kind of think the phraseology's a little off.
I feel that way too. Like referring to it as, if you're referring to the whole idea of a moral center, I think that's not quite right. But that's the term he uses, and I think it's close, but I don't think he's quite there. By the way, I'm mentioning this partly now because this will tie in with our discussion of sequels and such, but I'll explain that later, how it ties in. I'm saving that for a little bit later, okay? Because I've been thinking about this. Okay, sorry, continue.
Oh, because it's every story, and this is where I think the difficulty comes in, because I don't know if English has a word for what's really going on. Mm-hmm. Every story has a moral, a lesson, if you will.
Right.
Because every story plays out a certain way.
Right.
I think the big diff, though, where people might get a little wrapped around the axle about the wrong thing is, I don't think those are necessarily meant as teaching tools all the time.
I don't think they are either. I think in a lot of cases they just creep in.
Yeah, and they do, because another important thing there is creators aren't magical beings that just kind of evolve in the Cabbage Patch. Mm-hmm. Creators come out of the societies they're part of.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And depending on their relation with their society, they're going to tend towards different views. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, if somebody makes like some kind of weird, horrible, I guess the popular term now is torture porn, but we would have called them like slasher flicks. They're not necessarily saying that it's a good idea that inbred mutants should go around stabbing horny teenagers. But
they're not saying it's not, though.
Yeah, they're not saying they shouldn't. But there's this idea that something in that appeals to the creator.
Yes, definitely.
It feels right. The way it plays out feels right. And it might be because, as a creator, this is something they want to say to society. Mm-hmm. they might realize that this is something completely antithetical to society, but there's a dirty little pleasure about, putting it on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
They might have some kind of weird fascination with some aspect of it, and I don't necessarily mean in like a weird Freudian kind of way. I mean somebody might just be into special effects, so they make movies that just push special effects for the sake of pushing special effects.
Right, right.
You see a lot of art films do that. They'll do weird filming in that. It's not necessarily because they're trying to tell a specific story and make a specific statement. They're just screwing around with this new thing they found to do with the camera, and it creates a feeling.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah.
And because of that, I think when people say there's a moral to the story, they're expecting that Aesop, grim fairy tale-esque, this is the life lesson, and I don't think that's quite right.
I think it's not quite right, but there is something there. I mean, stories have... I'm not sure we have a proper word for it, to be honest, in English, as you just said, but I'm not sure. But it's a moral, a theme. There is an idea in almost every story. I can see that. There is a perspective about the way things should be in one form or another. Now, not necessarily, as you said, optimal. Like, we're not saying torture porn means inbred should be hunting down horny teenagers. But there's a catch, though. The fact that these people are doing these things, eventually, I'm assuming I don't watch torture porn films, if they're like every other horror film that's ever been produced by mankind, in the end, the torturers usually have the tables turned on them and usually die horrible deaths. I'm going to guess that's probably what happens. And some people escape. And they will usually escape by virtue of being good people or being smart or being clever, or something will happen that will allow the main characters to actually survive, the ones who do. And it's kind of a survival of the fittest thing. Again, going back to that I keep using the word moral, but again, that's not quite right. But again, I'm going to use the word moral because that's what Truby uses. Going back to that moral idea that if you are strong and smart and resilient and everything, you can survive anything, right? Yeah. And also that if you do evil, ultimately will come back to you, and you'll be killed by the people that you oppress. You can't use these evil methods because eventually it won't work out, etc. There are those ideals that are still in there, even in torture porn.
There are, but I think what ends up happening, because again, I think there's an assumption that when a creator does something, they do it knowingly. And what ends up happening a lot, and this is where the idea of expectation comes in, something just feels right. And it can feel right because it's satisfying, because it supports what we already believe, like that idea that good is rewarded, evil punished.
Right, exactly.
It can feel right because it conforms to the formula that we've all had over and over put into our heads.
Yep.
It can feel right for opposite reasons, like if you're doing like a very nihilistic story. And this is why you'll get like 14-year-old like goth kids will like really, really, really like nihilistic things, because they're, exalting that value of, life is meaningless, it's an existential quandary, blah. So anything that supports that, it resonates with the feelings. Right.
But again, that's a moral or like worldview perspective that's within that. So it's within that story, it's within that piece of art, and therefore it is still there. It resonates out. And something I've been thinking about this is that stories that don't have that don't offer a worldview, don't offer a perspective within them, is often why so many stories come across as flat.
Yeah.
And, I mean, not that just automatically because you have a worldview, it's automatically a good story. There are, of course, so many different factors and everything. But it's one of the things that when we say something is really bland, it's homogenous and everything, often that's really because it's not offering us anything new, not just novelty, but it's offering us a very simplistic, very limited worldview, a very limited moral framework that it's working within that isn't challenging anything. It's not even going near challenging. It's just kind of sitting there. Yeah. And therefore it feels very unsatisfying to us. We know exactly how it will work out. This isn't giving us anything that we really, I don't want to say challenged by, but it isn't giving us any novelty, as you would say earlier.
It's not stimulating.
It's not stimulating. And in fact, actually, here I might as well talk about it now. That's, I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, and what's supposed to be our topic for the day, when it comes back to remakes, reboots, and sequels. I think this is one of the real reasons that they actually fail. I think that very many reboots, remakes, and sequels often fail because they lack that moral center, that worldview center that the original had that gave it a certain spark. And in fact, they often end up being shallow pastiches of that original work that actually resonated with people. I think it's very hard for them to actually capture, as they say, lightning in a bottle again, but the lightning in a bottle they're trying to capture is really often that ethereal worldview, perspective, moral that was part of the original story. And it's not there anymore, and it often just ends up being a hollow shell that looks like the original but doesn't feel like one.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, but I think there's another component to the conundrum, and I think it's because and it goes back to the idea of expectation. That expectation gets formed in different ways. Like use the example of like the axe murderer movies that were really popular in like the 70s and the 80s. Mm-hmm. The prototype for them was the original Friday the 13th.
Right, yeah, definitely.
They existed before, but that was kind of the one that took off, and everything sort of followed that. And I'm going to do some like 40-year-old spoilers here, so if anybody hasn't seen like the original, you might want to...
Cover your ears, la 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 la.
Yep. But the whole premise of the story, and this was something that became a staple of the slasher flick, was that Jason drowned in the original because the counselors who were supposed to be watching him were off, like, you know, doing the horizontal mambo and not paying attention.
Yep. They were being horny teenagers. Yep.
And this is why all the horny teenagers in the films get killed off.
Right.
You find as slasher flicks came, and oh my God, there were so many of them, that idea stayed, that it was like the horny teenagers that died, the pure, chaste, virginal ones are the ones that survive. But you can kind of see as it went on that the reason for that got forgotten.
Yes, definitely.
That was just how you did the film.
Right, yeah.
And then that creates expectation, because if you had the innocent character get killed off first, the audience would be all like freaked out, and depending on where they were at in their own head at the time, they might think that was a clever twist, or they might be offended because this movie's stupid, it doesn't make any sense.
No, that's called Scream.
Yeah.
That's what they did with the Scream franchise, is that it's all about, the people who have sex are the ones who live. Haha. Among other things, because remember, it's supposed to be all the whole horror cliches, but, turned on their head.
Supposed to be, but
it really is just more of the same. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But that, again, was this idea that goes to that expectation. That whole slasher thing got played out. Scream comes out, and it's marketed as kind of a wink and a nod.
Yeah.
And then it's basically the same old slasher film again. But because you had just that little extra bit, just that wink and a nod, it felt different. So the audience's expectations, you've satisfied their quest for new without really making them knuckle under and deal with a completely new idea. Right.
But you were still offering them that little twist to the scenario, and that created a new element. So it's like, oh, how does this play out?
Yeah, that one difference, that one weird thing that you can add per story.
Exactly. Which goes back to my earlier statement that I said about we view stories almost as simulations. Maybe that's not quite the right word, but basically we want, it's like, oh, well, this is a tiny bit different. How will this play out this time? Yeah. If we add that one variable or variables, how do they change the story? And that's what keeps us interested.
But the thing... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Which should make sequels automatically successful. But as we both know, and most of the listeners know, that's usually not the case.
It's not, and I think that gets to the other idea, too, that perspectives change over time. And that's one of the things that I think the remakes, the reboots, the sequels, the one thing that it's difficult to deal with when you're making them is taking this familiar idea and twisting it up just enough
Right.
for the current audience.
Right.
And I think that's the challenge there comes in that you're taking their pre-existing expectations, but trying to hammer them into the new mold for how whatever that kind of story is done.
Yes. Yep. You are. And because remember, everyone's got their cool elements of the original that they want to have more of, that you want to give them more. Mm-hmm. And yeah, not only that, now we have the extra complication, as we brought up earlier, of international audiences.
Yep.
Which, of course, have different requirements because, going back to my theme so far for the episode, the whole moral idea, well, they have different concepts of what's right and wrong and different worldviews on things.
Yep.
And so some of it will not resonate with them. Mm-hmm. And actually, this goes back to something that happened before with the Star Wars sequel that came out, The Force Awakens.
Right.
Bombed like hell in China. Like, the Chinese just did not care about it. They did not care for it at all. The answer is because, well, yes, it's a watered-down version of what they see all the time. Yeah. Of, standard Chinese wuxia, fantasy stuff. That's all Star Wars is. It's novel to us because it's someone else's rut, but it's their rut. So, yeah, when they try to market this Star Wars to China, China is like, whatever, we don't care. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to interest them. But going to the sequels remake thing, it also explains, though, in a weird way, why the whole Transformers thing works. Now, this is this is an odd approach, but it both offers an American perspective, which is different from what the Chinese usually see, but offers stuff that they think is cool, and also offers as little, how can I put this?
Depth.
Actual story content as possible.
Right.
It's a blank slate, basically, that looks like a story that you can imprint whatever your moral fabric is onto.
Yeah, and I'd seen it was a Cracked article that talked about that, where they said the reason they're so popular worldwide is exactly that, because you don't need a lot of cultural understanding to get the idea of a giant robot run. It's a universal concept.
Yep, it is. It's a very universal concept. And there was another, might have been Cracked, but back in when it was good, concept that about how this is also why they don't make comedies anymore. There are almost no big budget comedies made anymore. It's because the studios know that humor doesn't translate worldwide.
Yeah, that's
it's too cultural. By default, it automatically has a moral center to it or a worldview, a cultural center to it that doesn't always translate and doesn't work. And so, therefore, it's not a good investment.
Yeah. Or it's a risky one, at any rate.
It's a risky one. And so, because, some cultures, some people are going to resonate no matter what country you're in, right? It's always going to work. There are people that think the Transformers movies are probably like some of the greatest pieces of art of mankind.
Yeah.
In this world, there are probably a scarily high number of those people. They're probably not listening to this podcast, but there are probably a very large number of them.
Yeah. Well, and then that ties in with the idea, too, that I think one of the reason your more nerdly productions tend to do well and be aimed at younger audiences is because they have less expectation.
Yes, they're kind of willing to accept whatever you give them because they don't have a lot to compare it to.
Yeah, and that it's an easier sell in that regard because they don't have a lot of, depending how young they are, say real world knowledge. Mm-hmm. So they don't realize that you can't fall 50 feet and get back up and keep going, and they don't have a lot of you're usually just starting to get into your society, like when you're say early teens, so you don't have a lot of necessarily cultural knowledge. You have it's very limited because you're not part of your society. You're probably not an active participant in government. You don't know what it's like to work a job where you live. You're kind of you've heard that from mom and dad, but it tends to be more I guess stereotyped.
Yeah,
a more simplified view of that, so it's an easier sell.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, so if I'm doing like a kid show, mom and dad just go to, and I'm making finger quotes, work. I don't have to explain what work is. It has something to do with an office, I guess. And that's enough because kids don't think about that.
Absolutely. No, you're 100% right. They don't. And it's that limited perspective. So they basically will accept whatever you tell them.
Well, provided it makes some kind of emotional response.
Right.
If they like it, then yes, this is going to form their template. If they don't, you've just phased yourself out. But that's, again, why you put in action, put in like weird monster kind of thing. A little rah, rah, rah. And it same works for adults, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. But going to that, though, I mean, people, if you tell someone something is true, for the most part, many people don't have the knowledge to actually sort and say whether it isn't true or not. Like we read in we read in novels, we see in movies, things that are like totally unrealistic, but we don't often have the knowledge to actually say whether they're realistic or not.
Yeah,
that's a common problem.
This is why I use the term expectation. Because that forms in different ways. If you have knowledge of something, like real world tangible knowledge, that will adjust what you expect. If you grew up I always use the example for running a role-playing game. You have to know your player group, because if I'm, say, going to run like a cop game or a detective game, I have to know my players to know their expectation. I have to know where their idea of, say, what a cop does comes from. Like if a couple of them are police, their expectation will be different than a guy whose idea of what police do comes from Bruce Willis movies.
Exactly. Yep.
And that happens with a lot of stuff. That happens with any kind of story you present. My favorite example of this was when the movie Johnny Mnemonic came out. We all went to the theater and saw it.
Right.
And I'll never forget this. We're watching the film. Everybody in the audience is just watching, and nobody's like really humming and hawing about nothing. And there's the one part where the preacher, the cyborg assassin guy, gets like hit with a box trailer, and he bounces down the road, and then they pan in on him lying there, and then his eyes light up and he gets back up. And at that point, the woman in front of me went, "Yeah, right, like that could happen." And I'm thinking, okay, first off, in real life, that's something, getting bumped with a truck at that speed, because it was supposed to be going fast, but it didn't look fast because, special effects. At that time, really running over an actor caused problems.
Yeah.
But in real life, that would be a survivable injury, and it's possible you would be conscious from it. And secondly, I thought, this woman has just watched like an intelligent talking dolphin, and a cyborg commando, and a guy with a computer in his head, and the one thing she couldn't get over was Buddy getting bumped by a van. Okay, but again, her expectations are different. She's coming in there with something else.
Right, yeah.
I don't understand it, but again, it's because it's too far removed from my perspective.
Yeah, everyone's bringing in their own perspective and their own ideas.
And that's one of the reasons why sticking to the genre rules, or doing familiar things or familiar actors or familiar characters, you're kind of superseding that, because you're hoping to know where the audience is coming in from.
You're hoping.
Yeah.
I mean, well, you're playing the odds, right? You're basically saying, well, this kind of movie works. The audience seems to like this stuff, so we'll do more of that.
Yep.
It really is that simple. And the problem is, of course, that if you don't do it correctly, you won't get the audience reaction you were hoping for.
Yep. And a lot of that too, it's a numbers thing. Like, that's why I'll keep coming back to Batman. We're at the point where if they make a Batman movie, it's gonna they're gonna ape the last Batman movie as best they can. Like, not the last one is in like Batman versus Superman, but the what was it, Ben Affleck? Not Ben Affleck, he did the
No, you're talking the Christopher Nolan one with Christian Bale as Batman. Yeah. Dark Knight trilogy, as they call it.
Yeah, because that's where you're expecting everybody's coming from.
Right.
And you're going to want to appropriate as much of that as you can, because that's the assumption. You're not going back to like the Mr. Mom one, because that's too far in the past. We're certainly not going to do the Adam West one.
Yep.
You're really not going to do the old 1940s like movie serial Batman.
Nope.
You're probably not borrowing from like the Super Friends or the Filmation cartoons. It's the same reason when you get to the bad guys, you're not going to have them fight Calendar Man or the Ten-Eyed Man, because that's not something in the public consciousness.
Right.
He's going to fight the Joker again at some point because that's what everybody expects. That's what they know.
Yep. Oh, no. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's the same for every superhero character. You fight the popular villains because that's what everyone knows. And that's what the audience wants, more or less. Yeah. In
general, though, and this is where I think in the modern day, currently, we have the problem is you could experiment, I think. I like to think. But they don't, and I think it's because from a production end, the formula for how you make a movie or how you make a comic or how you make a TV show is pretty well rooted at this point. That nobody's going to risk their career doing a Batman movie and saying, it's time that Batmite was brought to the screen in a serious dramatic film. Like it's just time for it. Nobody's going to take that risk.
No, and nor should they.
I don't know. I'd like to see Jack Black playing Batmite.
Okay, well, I'm sure you and a small cadre of others might. Okay, well, let's take a slightly different approach then. Okay, so generally speaking, we've made the statement that sequels do not generally work that well. That most films, when they try to make a sequel of it, it just does not go so well. But we've already mentioned superhero movies, like they did Batman Begins, and then Christopher Nolan followed up by two extremely well received. I'm not going to say they were good, but extremely well received Batman films that came out.
Right.
Marvel is literally chunking out sequels and quasi sequels because it's all tied in together. And they're up to like 16 movies or something at this point.
Right.
And they just keep pumping them out. And oddly enough, some of them are getting better and better. I mean, I just saw the trailer for the new Thor movie. And to be honest, the first two Thor movies really kind of sucked. And the first one was so-so. The second one's definitely sucked. Sorry, guys. The third one looks freaking awesome. It looks like they finally found a new direction for this character that actually might be entertaining and interesting.
Right.
And again, they've drawn it from the comic books and from the background material. But my point is that Marvel seems to have found a way to keep this stuff fresh or somewhat interesting and make sequels work to one degree or another. They haven't always been winners. One would probably not say that all the Iron Man films, for example, were as awesome as the first one.
Right.
But they've still managed to find a way to keep it fresh and keep it interesting, whereas many other companies' sequels fail. Like they try to do a second Ghostbusters or a second whatever, another Pirates of the Caribbean. I think they're up to Pirates of the Caribbean 6.
Right.
And each one seems to get worse than the one before it. And of course, as you've mentioned, they how many Friday the 13th did they make, etc. And they don't seem to get better. They seem to generally get worse. Yet, for some reason, the Marvel ones seem to have actually gotten better with time, not worse.
Well, I think when you specifically talk sequels, the trick you have to do with a sequel is each one has to add a little something to the overall story.
Okay.
There's a problem with a lot of them, especially the nerdly ones, that what they add is more. So I think the superhero thing is always first movie's the origin.
Yep.
The second movie introduces like the like big dramatic villain. The third one, the hero fights the evil version of himself, I think is the thing. They'll do like, put 8 villains in this one. That's even better. Because that was the problem, like say the Iron Man ones.
Right.
They kind of start getting, and he fights another guy who's like a power armor guy. Okay. And then, but he's got like mini armor in a suitcase. Well, that's interesting, but that, I don't know if would keep people's attention for a whole movie.
That's true.
You look at, say, Star Wars. First one comes out. Everybody thought it was great. Second one comes out. no, I am your father. Everybody's like, oh my God, that's great. Third one comes out, they're like, Ewoks, well, okay, I guess whatever. But the third one wraps up the story.
So everyone just accepts it anyway, except for
Yeah.
Chad.
Yeah, but it added that something. It's the Daniel, and I think that's why Return of the Jedi was the least popular of the original ones, because it wrapped everything up that was already there. It didn't really expand on things, so you needed it. It did the trick. You watched it. You thought, well, it's pretty good. It's a good ending, but it didn't have the big impact because this was something you needed.
Right, yeah.
And then they do like the prequels.
Mm-hmm.
And the prequels aren't really adding anything except Jar Jar Binks, and you're like, okay. And prequels have the problem that everybody knows where this goes.
Yes.
And that creates that problem is not only you're not adding new, you're taking away. Because we see Darth Vader as like this giant armored badass who chokes people out by just kind of pointing at them, and you're like, oh man, he's awesome. And then you see he's this like whiny little kid, and you're like, oh, okay, that takes a little of the majesty away.
Just a little.
And then they hype it up like, oh, he's in the pod race. What's going to happen? He's going to win. He's not going to die. You know, he accidentally ends up in space. Is he going to die? No, he's not, because we know that in another 20 years he's Darth Vader. And I think that's why, like, say, prequels that directly tie in tend to not do so good because of that.
Right.
Because they're not adding. Continuing with Star Wars, they did The Force Awakens. People, it was met with a resounding meh. In no small part because it's basically like the original story again.
Yeah. It was just the original for a new generation.
Yeah, which it does the trick. The kids probably don't really give a huge amount of crap about the very original. Like, they've seen it, dad loves it, it's okay, but it looks kind of silly. The new one comes out, it's like, this might be your first Star Wars. Okay, it gets the idea across. Like, I saw it and I thought, okay, it does the trick. Like you say, it's Star Wars for a new generation. It wasn't horrifying, it wasn't spectacular, it just kind of happened, sure. Rogue One comes out, people are like losing fluids huge. I think, again, because it satisfies that need for Star Wars, it gives you enough of the familiar, so people are like, ooh, AT-ATs, look, new Stormtroopers, that's awesome. But it doesn't directly tie in, so it feels like something new.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And that's it fits that idea that any kind of a sequel, and a prequel really is just a sequel in front, has to add something. It has to embiggen the story or the characters. It can't just be more of the same. And if you're just doing, like, say, the Iron Man thing, it's another guy in armor, well, you get that fatigue quicker because another guy in armor isn't that new.
Right. That's true. You have to do something different, which I think the Marvel movies have generally been reasonably good for. They've been trying some different stuff with them, and not all of them, as obviously the Iron Man one failed. The Thor sequel, The Dark World, didn't go very well either. Partly because there was nothing new there. It's just like, okay, more of the same.
It's another army of generic bad guys. Oh, quick, Kurosawa-esque fight scene. Wah, hoo, ha. Okay, well, I've seen
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so there are limits. And I like your idea, though. The idea that depending on what variables you bring in determines how quickly fatigue sets in. Where you've seen this, the blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm done. And so that's actually, that's something interesting to think about. Yeah, the fatigue definitely plays a part of it. Whether you call it story fatigue, basically. Quick, kicks in pretty quick. And again, when you combine that with the idea that, again, it's not offering anything new in any sense, both from worldview or from a content perspective. I mean, there are different angles that can offer new material.
Yeah.
But if there's nothing there, well, it's going to fail. There's nothing there. And I think that's one of the things that happens with reboots, to bring them up for a second. So a lot of reboots are literally just a stripped-down version of the original. There's literally nothing new there. In fact, they don't even want there to be new there. The only new bits are usually twists on the original that are usually not as clever as the director or writers thought they were.
Yeah, I think a reboot is a soft remake.
Yeah, that's what it is. 100%.
Yeah, I think you're right that what they're basically when they do a reboot is they're trying to hang on to the original,
Mm-hmm.
but usually for a marketing reason, uh, do something a little different so it feels like a new thing.
Right.
And I think that's like the Spider-Man movies. You'll get that where it's a new guy playing Peter Parker because the old guy is 40 now.
Right.
But they're not really mixing it up, so it's really weird because now you're like, well, you kind of retold the story and you kind of changed this stuff. Oh, it's not MJ this time; it's going to be Gwen Stacy. Yeah, but it's basically the same story. And when you did the other Spider-Man that it was MJ, well, you basically appropriated Gwen Stacy's story for that one already. So if you're familiar with the comic, it already feels messed up. If you're not familiar with the comic, it kind of just feels like the same thing with a blonde this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of like reboots don't go over because you've already admitted defeat.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, you're already saying, well, we don't have anything new, but I mean to quote The Simpsons, new hat, I have to get one, new hat. But anyway.
Right. Yep. No, I agree. Yeah, you're basically saying, well, we couldn't come up with anything new, so we're going to just cover the old in chocolate and try to sell it to you again.
Yeah. Yeah, basically.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, and sometimes it works. I mean, the audiences do go. I mean, the new Star Trek reboots did reasonably well. Spider-Man, Batman, I mean, every time they reboot the characters, they seem to do reasonably well. For at least one film anyway, sometimes two or three.
Yeah.
And so definitely reboots and remakes do actually work, sometimes anyway. I think it just depends on the creative team that's involved and what they bring to the table.
Yeah, and there's some luck, and it depends who your audience ended up being.
There's that too.
Because I can think of all kinds of stuff over the years with people I've known that they would love something for the strangest reason.
Mm-hmm.
The best example I can think of was back when they did the Next Generation Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Randy was a huge Trekkie.
Right.
Like, she was a huge stereotypical, memorized every line, probably worse than Jack Trekkie.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't watch it with her, because anytime they showed a new spaceship, she'd pause every scene, and she'd frame by frame every scene of a new spaceship and discuss, oh, that looks like the 59C landing light from the... And you'd be like, hey, just show the fucking show, Randy. Episode's an hour long, and we've been here 2 hours. But it was but it was because, and you'll see this with nerdly art, especially Trek. Trek's a good example, that they love those things like the tech.
Right.
And there's a certain percentage of your audience that if you amp up the tech, they're going to love it.
Yeah.
I think Gundam has been running on that for a long time now.
Yes.
But you risk the by doing that of alienating everyone else who's not that into it. And now by amping that part up, you're detracting from the other stuff.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, well, also, the thing is, for some films and such, I mean, sometimes that's the new, right? That's what you're offering. Because you know that the story is not going to be that original or interesting, so you just need to focus on an element, like, say, the tech, for example, and say, well, this is the new we're bringing to the story. I mean, we know that you're not going to be interested so much in the plot or whatever, so that's what we're going to bring. We're going to bring, like, new tech, cool new visuals, whatever.
Yeah.
A new visual experience.
And that was what kept the back in like the 80s the axe murder movies going.
Right.
Was that if you could come up with a new weird story for the axe murder, that was the selling point of the film. Nobody gave a shit about the plot. Nobody remembered the names of any of the kids.
Right. But that's how murder mysteries have kept going for God knows how many years, right? It's all about coming up with a clever new way to kill people. Yeah,
and I don't think it's necessarily bad, but if you're going to do something like that, you got to know your audience, and you have to have those ideas. It's superheroes too, forever. The superhero never changes, especially say in the comic. It's about the villain.
Yeah, it's true. Well, again, because the hero can't change.
Yeah, and if you can keep coming up with interesting villains, then you have an interesting story.
Yeah.
I think the idea too, with the reboot kind of ties in with when you translate something from one medium to another as well, because I think you get a lot of the same problems. That you're basically taking this idea and to fit it into a new medium, you're kind of filing stuff off,
Right.
and you're kind of toning it down, because tying into with that idea of adding the one new element, you don't want to overwhelm the audience with all kinds of new.
Right.
Case in point, currently they're running ads for the Ghost in the Shell live action movie.
Right.
The comic and even the animated series, I'm not a huge fan, but yeah, and you know that a lot of the comic net, what made it interesting is that Cheryl's like a sociology like professor kind of thing, and the book was about the tech and how it fit in and society, and it was this big picture kind of story. The movie looks like Resident Evil, except the naked chick is different.
Some of that's the way they're marketing it. I have a pretty good idea of what the story is. I haven't seen the movie, the live action one.
Yeah.
But I know the plot line that it's based on. I know the story it's based on. And it won't really play out that way. But that's how they're marketing it, because again, they're trying to convince the audience that no, this is like that other thing that you love and spend money on.
Yeah.
So therefore you can trust it and come see it.
Yeah.
It's all about making the audience comfortable.
Yeah, and that's the idea, because like I say, it's Resident Evil. And they made you into this. Well, they can't control me. I don't remember that being a big Ghost in the Shell thing.
Yeah, she didn't really care.
No, and it was a cop story.
Well, because Cheryl loves cop stories.
Yeah.
It's a cop story. It's, they're high level police, high level super cyborg police, but yeah, they're police basically. And that's what it's about. I mean, there's elements of like sociology and how humans are going to interact with machines and everything and all that. And I'm sure there's a bare whisper of those ideas in this new film, but I'm sure most of them got edited out pretty fast.
Yeah, and even in the ad too, the idea that there's this like secret group that made her into the killer cyber. As I recall, in Ghost in the Shell, that kind of shit was all like off the shelf.
Pretty much, yeah.
But again, that they're taking it down to something that's more familiar, that's more.
But okay, so let's get into something then, because before this show you sent me some articles.
Okay.
One of which talked about how were doing research. I believe it was UCLA that researcher was at. That basically they found out that he found that when they spoiled stories, people actually enjoyed them more.
Yeah, if you remember too, Chad talked about that years ago. That he said no, that they know that if the audience knows how it ends, they like it better.
Yeah, which is very odd, but I guess maybe it's because they feel more relaxed. They're not as tense. They feel happier. They like it better, but I can't help but wondering if it's because they're more sedated by the whole experience. It's less challenging for them and more sedating if they know. They don't have to worry about anything. There's no fear, anxiety, or real heavier emotions involved. So they like it better, but they like it better in the same way that people zone out after a hard day of work watching TV.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That people at least think they want something more like passive from the entertainment. I've often doubted that, and I've mentioned this to the people at my one job all the time, because they're always saying, "Oh, I'm tired," and blah blah. And it's like, well, you're not tired, you're fatigued. It's not tired as physical. It's because you're doing the same thing day after day, and you go home and do the same stuff. There's no challenge, there's no input, there's no mental stimulus, and people need some need more than others. But you get into that because that takes work. And it takes effort, and again, people are too wore out or too in the groove that they don't want to put forth that effort, and that's one of the reasons why the same old works. And if you spoil the ending, there isn't that tension.
Yeah.
That I think in the last 20 years or so, we've gotten way too used to being pandered to the point that even if we're supposed to be watching a tense, same film, we don't like to feel that tension. It's an alien emotion to us.
Yes. And that's why there are other cultures that do make films with that tension. And that's why every now and then there'll be like a Korean horror film or thriller or something like that everyone will go apeshit for.
Yeah.
And usually that's because it has those emotions in it. And we're just not used to feeling them anymore. And so people will be like, oh my God, check out this horror flick about this girl that crawls out of TVs and stuff. Because, American horror had become so blah and had lost that edge to it. And so suddenly people went nuts for The Ring. And or that Korean movie Old Boy that came out where it's a revenge flick and everything, but it offered some raw feelings and such and tension that you weren't quite sure how it was going to turn out. But you'll notice they don't want a steady diet of that. They want some of that. They want to feel that now and then, and those films often do stand out in their memory and do resonate with them. But very quickly they go back to the same old pretty fast.
Yeah, because it's taxing. It's like one of Corin's speeches at work where he said, people don't want to think. Thinking hurts. It makes the blood flow to the brain. You get a headache. You're like, what is this? I'm getting these pictures in my head and my skull is throbbing. I don't like this.
Yep.
And I think, again, some of it's climatization. And I think, because what ends up happening is it's also that conflict that if you shock the audience too much, they're going to turn out because they're either going to be like horrified, you're going to lose them, those intense feelings are going to start wearing them out. But if you don't put any of that, then the fatigue sets in quicker because you're not getting that visceral kick in any capacity.
Right, yeah.
Like you can watch the Horrible Housewives of wherever, and when they're arguing, it's like your brain, like you said, our brains can't tell the difference between reality and imagination. So when they're arguing on TV, it's like watching an actual argument. Your subconscious is like, bitches going to hit each other. And it gives you that kick. After a bit, you know which one is the obnoxious one. You know which one is the selfish one. You know how they're going to react. It's not interesting. But if we now make the Horrible Housewives somewhere else, it's just different enough. You get that little bit of kick. You put that little bit of effort in while you're learning, okay, which is the queen bitch of this bunch, which is the calm one, which is the stuck-up one. And it gives you that little kick for a bit. And then once that gets tired, you make the Horrible Housewives of some other place.
Yep, exactly.
And it goes on until you end up going somewhere that your audience can't relate to. It's the Horrible Housewives of Uzbekistan, and people are like in America are like, I don't get this. Like, what? Why do they have goats? Like, what is the? And then they tune out, or you've played that formula to the point where even that formula now creates fatigue because they've seen it so many times.
Yeah, they can't get any more variations out of it. They're kind of done.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you have two options, which is go back right to the original formula, which might actually still be interesting again because it's been so long, or which is often what they try and usually fails, or just give it a break. Just say, yep, we're going to take a break. We're going to do something else for a while.
Because that kind of gets into the third thing we were going to discuss, that being a remake.
Yes.
Because a remake is an attempt to take an established property, I'll say, be it character, story, whatever, and move it into the current audience.
Yes.
And in a way, that's what happens when a formula gets like really played out. It goes away for a bit until either everybody's kind of forgotten it, you've got the next generation of audience who didn't see it in the first place, or someone manages to come up with something that's just enough of a twist that it freshens it up and now everybody's into it again.
Yep. That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, remakes often end up being, we'll say, inferior to the original. There are exceptions. There are definitely exceptions. But remakes often are inferior because, again, they usually tend to lack that center and that vision and everything that the original had. And also, originals, of course, are usually products of their time. And that's another big part of it. As you said, you're updating it for the new generation, but do you really have that sense of the new generation that the original creators had that allowed them to tap into the current culture of their time?
Yeah, I think he hit a couple things there too, because this is one of the places geezerisms come from.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the old audience is still around and still vocal,
mm-hmm.
they of course are likely not going to enjoy the new thing because it's not what they're used to.
Right.
And that's where you go, no, ours was better. No, it wasn't better. It was just a little different. Mm-hmm. The actors were different. It's also one of the reasons why sometimes you can't overcome that, because if enough of your audience remembers the old,
right,
you don't have that novelty.
Mm-hmm.
Like on a personal level, that's one of the reasons I didn't care for The Walking Dead.
Right.
Because I remember 80s zombies movies, and I've seen it. I've seen people squabbling, going from like Conclave of Survivor to Conclave of Survivor, where everything looks cool till you find out they're cannibals.
Yep.
I've seen it, but zombies hadn't been around for a bit, and then that comic came out, and then zombies took off, and they did the show, and then that became representative of zombies.
Right.
But again, like I say, for me,
mm-hmm.
I wasn't into it because I've seen this. For
here.
Yeah, for people younger than me, they may not have seen like a proper zombie movie, so it was something they could get into.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for people in general, I mean, remember, it was appealing to an audience that probably didn't watch like the original Dawn of the Dead and things like that back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Even the zombie movies of the 80s, yes, there was a bit of a zombie culture craze back in the very early 80s, but it still wasn't quite on the scale that the Walking Dead craze or zombie craze has been in the last 10 years, say.
No, but it was similar.
It was similar. That's true.
It was more a home video thing.
Yeah. But the key point again is that zombie films were a little bit different back then, and so they were a little more counterculture, is my point. And The Walking Dead, on the other hand, appealed to a general mass audience. Like, it really tuned into it. It brought in a mass audience, it connected with them, and therefore that's why it became such a huge mega hit.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, anyway.
Yeah, and then that's again because the audience changes, their expectations change. They're going to get something out of it.
Yep.
And if you do a remake, especially nowadays, you always luck out that people who are into newer zombie movies probably don't watch the old ones because the effects aren't as good. And
yep.
Like I say, a lot of them were a home video thing, so they didn't have the budget even for the day.
Oh, yeah. Usually they were pretty bad.
Yeah.
Well, they were bad in the effects department. They weren't necessarily bad in the makeup. Some of them actually had very clever makeup and different approaches and could be actually even more visceral than the modern stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, they don't follow the modern standards. So there we go. All right, but so anyway, so back to what we were talking about, So the modern audience has certain expectations, and you want to meet them while remaking the old, and it sometimes doesn't work.
Yeah, and
often doesn't work.
Yeah, I've seen a few, but a lot of times, because what you end up, it's like you were saying before, everything's a product of its era.
Yep.
And when the era changes and the audience changes, a lot of times you lose what made that thing stand out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to translate it while keeping the feel of the original. Like a lot of remakes nowadays, what they'll just do is take the names of stuff and slap it onto the standard for whatever that is.
Yeah.
So,
for example?
Any like kind of, well, Star Trek.
Okay.
The new Star Treks are really not Star Trek. They're sci-fi action series 5. Yeah,
I agree. They're generic sci-fi action series. That's literally what they are.
Yeah.
Which is not entirely surprised because the guy who made them, J.J. Abrams, admitted that he never watched the original series and didn't care for it, for what he'd seen. So he was just making his idea of a generic sci-fi action series.
Yeah, and because Trek is supposed to be a little more highbrow.
Supposed to be.
Yeah, that's what made it not Star Wars.
That's true.
And then the movies, they don't really, they're straight up action. They borrow some of the names. They don't have the same history really. They don't have a lot of the characters are different.
Mm-hmm.
The backstory is different. But they called it Star Trek because it sounds better than generic space fantasy number 8.
Well, yeah, pretty much. So yeah, that's definitely true. Sorry, go.
Oh, I was going to say too, and it's the idea that I don't know if you could do a big like theatrical production of Star Trek now, because I don't know if you have the audience, enough of an audience that would be receptive to that slightly more highbrow kind of thing at the moment.
That would be interesting. Could you do it? I would say yes, but it would be very difficult. And you would require artist, and I really do mean an artist at the helm who has a real vision. So it would require someone with a real artistic vision and a real artistic sensibility who could bring something different to it that offered something that was a bit on the artsy side, an artsy/intellectual side, while still delivering something that offered the spectacle basically that the audience wants.
Yeah, that can be tricky to do.
It is tricky to do, and it's a risk, which is exactly why the studios won't do it.
Yeah. Until they have to. Until they're out of options.
Yeah. Until they have to, or until you get a superstar artsy director who has already made his name and whose name will sell tickets and everything, who comes in and is offering their vision of it. Like they're brought in specifically to offer something like that or different by the studio. That's the only other time you could really see it happen.
Yeah.
And then the audience will probably either love it or hate it, depending on how it works out.
Yeah, it's not going to be an in-between for that.
No. So, yeah, one way or the other. Anyway, so we should probably bring this a little more to a close because I'm starting to really run down energy-wise. Okay. So what else do we want to cover? Is there anything in particular?
Well, I always think about talking about remakes. One thing that I kind of laugh, because there was a tendency for a bit to do remakes as the dark, gritty version of stuff.
Right.
I always think it'd be funny, like, to take inappropriate things and redo. Like, can you imagine nowadays if they redid All in the Family?
Ooh. That would not go over very well.
No, because it's the idea that you weren't supposed to empathize with Archie. He was supposed to be an obnoxious racist, and that was the joke.
Right.
But even if you did that nowadays, I'm wondering if people would take that as a joke, or they'd just be highly offended that this guy said this.
I think they would be just highly offended because that's how they get attention on the internet.
Yeah, it could be. And then again, it tends to, there's inertia. That
I mean, going with your idea, though, there are probably some things that probably should be remade. There are probably many things. I mean, Chad mentioned one during our cult movies one that we did, bad movies, sorry, not cult, where he said that, we should be remaking them. And I agree with him 100%. There are some old movies and old properties and stuff that if they did, just by their very weird or obscure nature, would probably produce very interesting films or could really be fascinating brought to a modern audience.
Yeah.
They will almost never be made, but or chosen, but you probably could do some interesting stuff with it.
You could. My shtick is I always want to see something new, but there are a lot of things that if they brought them back and they kind of kept the point.
Yes.
Like sometimes you do things sideways and it doesn't work out, and it kind of should have. Like I think of when they made the Green Hornet movie.
Right. And
everybody was upset because he wasn't Batman. Because the Green Hornet was basically, you go back to the 40s, he's your generic masked man of mystery here. He was Batman with a different outfit.
Yeah.
And I can kind of see that, but I can see if you're bringing that back, you don't want to do that, because then everybody would just go, oh, it's like a Batman ripoff.
Exactly.
But the irony was, I thought it was an interesting film, and I have to wonder if they had have just made up a new character,
right?
Would it have gone over better?
Because I would bet the answer is no. I think it probably would have gotten ignored.
I don't know. Seth Rogen's in it, and he's known for wacky comedy. And I think if you had have not called it Green Hornet, people would have thought, oh, it's Seth Rogen doing a wacky superhero comedy.
Yeah, but the Green Hornet's Batman, but he has that weird high concept aspect to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the other reasons why people didn't know how to take it. For those who aren't familiar, the Green Hornet basically pretends to be like the most badass crime boss in his city.
Mm-hmm.
But he's really actually a superhero who's using his quote-unquote crime boss status to screw with all the other crime bosses.
Yeah.
And put them all out of business, which is a very oddly high concept. It's one of the reasons why the Green Hornet I don't think has ever truly taken off. It had its brief renaissance when Bruce Lee was Kato, but I think people cared more about Bruce Lee as Kato than they did about the Green Hornet, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And it's had various times when it's had, it has a cult following basically, but it's not something that ever really took to the mainstream. And I think some of that is its very concept, its very core, doesn't quite work with the mainstream. It's got a clever originalness to it, and going back to what I said, it offered a slightly original take on things. Yeah. But that's also why I don't think it made to the mainstream, and I don't think it would work at the mainstream, even if they called it something else.
See, I think it might, because again, with Batman, you've got the guy who uses fear, and the idea that, especially in when they go back to his origin, that he's not entirely trusted by the public or the authorities. And Green Hornet's just a little bit more of that.
That's true. Well, okay, I see your point, but I still think he's a little bit higher concept than most people would take. But again, I guess it depends. Also, the movie itself, which I overall liked, is still actually a bit of an uneven movie that can't quite decide whether it does want to be a serious superhero movie or whether it wants to be a weird, wacky comedy. And it kind of waffles in between, and I think it suffers for that.
Yeah, I can see that too. I think, again, because they're trying to... It seemed like they're trying to fit it to the idea of the character as established.
Exactly. So, yeah, the Green Hornet. Okay, I don't think that would have made a huge difference, but maybe I'm wrong. And you never know. I mean, and there's the reverse, which is of course Nolan's Dark Knight Batman trilogy, which, from my perspective, that's not Batman. It's not. It's Christopher Nolan's Batman-like superhero, but that's not Batman. I'm sorry. I know Jack Ward is pulling his hair out right now, but there is of it because Jack Ward thinks it is. We've had that argument, Jack and I. But no, it's Nightman. But if they'd called him Nightman instead of Batman, nobody would have gone to see it. No one would have cared. Yeah. And so they called him Batman instead. And I can see the perspective that, no, Batman's a flexible character. There are different versions, but no, that's not Batman. This is a rich, millionaire playboy trying to be a Batman cosplayer who can barely fight in that armored suit of his and kind of limping through while other people basically dance around him, and he survives just because he's the hero.
Oh, so he's the Green Hornet.
Also, pretty much, yeah. I mean, and heck, even in the Dark Knight trilogy, people pointed out he's actually only Batman for a period of maybe like 2 years, and then he retires and quits. Right, like within the setting. Sorry, that's not Batman. I mean, that's not that's another superhero. I suppose you could make that claim. Oh, it's a realistic take. No, that's not Batman. That's not the driven guy who spends his life, fighting, the good fight and, trying to solve Gotham's crime problems and such. That's not him. This is a millionaire dilettante cosplayer who's pretending to be Batman.
See, and that gets to what we were discussing all along, that idea that, say for you and Jack, you have this different set of expectations in your head, and when you get to that Batman, it's too far removed from yours for you to get into it, but it's close enough to his that he can get into it, and even if it's a new take, it's still something he can appreciate because it fits more along his train of thought.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, it all comes back to audience expectation. And I think that kind of brings everything around, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's all about audience expectation in the end and working with your audience and what's in their heads.
which makes me think,
Hmm.
there's some poor person
Right?
out there in the world that at some point in their life they went to see a Star Wars movie
Hmm.
and were, because of their expectation and their previous experiences, they were sorely disappointed to not see B. Arthur singing in it.
Oh, you have to bring that up, don't
I
you?
do.
Yeah, well, you're probably right. I mean, there probably was some person who actually liked the Star Wars Holiday Special and thought that Star Wars was a singing, dancing extravaganza,
Yep.
and they were expecting a musical in space. Um,
Wouldn't that have made the Phantom Menace better?
there are many things that would have made the Phantom Menace better. Although, I actually argue that of the prequels, I think the Phantom Menace is the best film of those three movies.
Okay.
Um, and Yeah, no, really. I mean, of the prequels, I mean, because they get progressively worse, I would argue. Like they're the second one. Anyway, whatever. The key point is that I'm not a big prequel fan, as many are not, and I
Right.
think that the Phantom Menace is the closest one, I think, to a Star Wars film of them.
Okay.
Oddly enough. Maybe it's because it does have the kid and Tatooine and everything like that, but at least I like the Jedi in the Phantom Menace are actual badasses.
Hmm.
Like that's something I actually liked about the Phantom Menace is the first 10, 15 minutes of the film where they go on that Trade Federation ship and the Trade Federation guys are freaking the hell out because oh my god, two of these Jedi guys showed up. And it really sets the mood. It really is like these guys are, super badasses.
Right.
And it works and it goes from there. I mean, there are some elements of the film that do actually work. If you were to cut out a lot of the stuff with the kid and everything with Jar Jar, I think it might actually not be that bad a film. I know there's the somewhat infamous, I haven't seen it, but I heard it's quite good, Phantom Edit, where an editor went in and basically all of Jar Jar's dialogue is now just gobbledygook, which is subtitled.
Uh-huh.
And he got rid of a lot of the comedy and he toned down some of the kids stuff and everything. And apparently the film's actually pretty good.
Huh. Weird.
I've often wanted to see that, just because to see if it's really true. But I could see that there could be not a great film, but a much better film in there. And maybe that's why I always thought that of the movies, The Phantom Menace is actually the one that I actually can kind of appreciate.
Wow.
I know I can hear from your tone of voice. You don't quite agree.
Well, I'm thinking it's not a glowing review, but that's probably the closest to a positive review I've seen of that film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Phantom Menace also suffers a lot from, again, audience expectations.
Yeah.
When it came out, there hadn't been a Star Wars film in like 20 years, and people were literally losing their minds over it. I mean,
Yeah.
Today's fans may not realize this, but when the Phantom Menace came out, people literally camped out for weeks, if not months, to be
Yeah.
the first person to see that film. Like, it was literally like Jesus Christ had come back to the earth and was going to be showing on May 5th or whatever, was going to be in the Hollywood Bowl and you were going to have a chance to see him.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of fan energy that went into that was just astounding. And equal amounts of fan disappointment obviously occurred after it came out, but I think it was already being held to such a high standard.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Again, I'm not saying it's a great film. I'm not. But,
Please don't egg my house.
Exactly. But I do think that it was held to a very high standard.
Yeah.
That it didn't reach. But I think that people just went a little far with it. Now, the ones that came after that, which are more just kind of like generic action fests.
Right.
I mean, they lack heart, they lack soul, they're very wooden, they're very just clunky films.
Yeah.
And for a number of reasons, George Lucas being number one on the list. And so I think they deserve a lot of the scorn that they get. I think they've got their moments too, but for the most part, they're not very good films.
Right. Well, that, and I always had the problem with them, like I was saying, I know how this turns out.
Well, yeah, and going back to, as we said about prequels, I generally think prequels are a bad idea.
Yeah.
I think it's a general rule is that prequels, again, this is general, there can be exceptions, but a general rule is if you want to make a prequel, don't do it. Just
Yeah.
don't do it, man. I mean, because prequels almost never work out because they almost never really add anything and the audience already knows where it's going.
Yeah.
The only way I have found that you could make a prequel and make it half decent, and this is again pushing things a tiny bit, but I can see it, is where you make a prequel, but it's actually about different characters than maybe it leads in, basically the Rogue One approach, basically.
Yeah.
Where it's really about different characters, it's a different film, but it does tie into the story, so it builds up in a different way, but you're telling effectively a new story in the same setting with some of the same variables or some of the same elements to it.
Right.
I think that can work, and I think that's where the Star Wars prequels definitely fell down. I think the fact that they tried to make it Anakin's story was an interesting idea, but ultimately didn't work. As you said, they ultimately all they did was kind of ruin Darth Vader in a way.
Yeah. You know what Star Wars story they really need to tell?
Oh, God. Okay, what one? Besides B. Arthur.
Oh, I was going to say the ice cream guy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there we go.
He's got an action figure.
That is true.
Yeah.
Someone did do that. But I think that we can probably live without it.
Maybe.
Although I'm sure there's some, Star Wars fanfic about him. Don't worry. You could probably go looking on like Wikipedia or something. You'll find an actual whole expanded universe canon story about that dude.
Oh, there is. There's like I said, he's got his own action figure. If I remember,
Then obviously there is.
if I remember correctly, Hasbro did one because that ice cream maker thing he's carrying is supposed to be a data core from Cloud City, and it contains some kind of top special secret awesome information he's trying to keep from the Empire.
Right. Okay.
And he's in the film for probably all of 25 seconds.
Right.
But I would watch his story, especially if it was a musical.
Okay, then. Yeah, I believe it's time to go. So, thank you, everyone, for listening to our discussion of sequels, reboots, remakes, and whatever else. Hopefully you found this interesting, even if it has wandered off a little track towards the end. And it's given you something to think about. Is there a real answer about sequels, remakes, and reboots? The answer is not really, just that probably most cases we're better off just not making them. But that's just my take on it. I mean, obviously the Marvel movies have proven me wrong to one degree or another. But again, with them, they tend to keep reinventing themselves. And I think that maybe that's the key. If you're going to do this stuff, you really have to do some reinvention. You can't just rest on what came before. You have to offer something new, truly new, if you want it to work.
Right.
So, good night, folks, and take care.
I need a new shtick.
Maybe the audience can write in and suggest one for you.
Oh, we can start a petition. Get Ice Cream Guy his own movie.
Good night, folks. Bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.